Hello, my name is Kirioth, and today we're going to have a little chat about the greater good, Psychic Awakening, the greater good to be totally precise, and it's because we are going to see Tau, Imperial Guard, and Genestealer Cult for that book, but there is no inclusion of Death Guard, and that's had a few knock-on effects. It's a bit controversial, I think it's fair to say, but I don't think it's quite worth some of the reactions that it's gained. On the one hand, yes, it is definitely not confusing, I'd say, but it definitely built expectations. The short story Beyond the Star-Tide Nexus made explicit reference to the Death Guard. You know, Commander Shadowsun is fighting a plague fleet and has to break away. They are not doing well. They're being overwhelmed by the Death Guard, and so they have to redeploy elsewhere. Now, it would be safe to assume that the backdrop for the greater good would be the Death Guard pursuing and catching up to, and that's not an unreasonable thing to assume. That's not an unreasonable thing to believe is going to happen. And of course, it's totally reasonable if you are a Death Guard player to get your hopes up, to look at that and go, oh cool, so this is my book. And it's not, which is not great, it's not brilliant, it's not something that you shouldn't be slightly disappointed by, but I think there's a difference between being slightly disappointed by something and, I guess the phrase is losing your shit over it, because some of the feedback, putting that quite diplomatically, has been, I think, a little bit excessive. I think it's almost as though some people have taken the lack of Death Guard in the greater good to mean that Games Workshop don't give a shit about Death Guard. I mean, I have seen comments to that effect, which I would suggest is not really accurate. Death Guard has got a pretty decent model range of their own. Of the 3 Primarchs that are currently available, one of them is Mortarion. I would argue, personally, of the 3 Primarchs that are currently available, Mortarion's is the best model as well. If a little bit cluttered, take some of the chains off, and you're good, but it's not as though Games Workshop don't care and never have cared. That's demonstrably not the case, demonstrably not true. Death Guard not being in the greater good is disappointing for those who are expecting it, but it's not an indication that Death Guard are going to get nothing. I think the thing to remember, and the thing that is probably in some ways trickier to think about when you have built your hopes up, is that you're not getting your thing right now, no, and that does suck if you're expecting it, if you were looking forward to it. But Games Workshop has stated several times at this point that everyone is going to get they're going to get stuff in Psychic Awakening. Psychic Awakening is a galaxy-wide event that is going to cover every faction. Everyone's going to get new rules, everyone's going to get new items, everyone's going to get new. You will get new. No matter who you are, who you play, no matter what the size of your faction is relative to other factions in the game, you're going to essentially get basically equal treatment. That hasn't stopped being true for Death Guard because this short story didn't lead to them being in this book. If anything, that short story, I think, has turned out to be the precursor to a couple of books. Instead of just being the precursor to one, it's the precursor to a couple. I mean, obviously it set the stage for Tau entering the conflict that they are in the greater good against Imperial Guard and Genestealer Cult in a big 3-way cluster. But there's also the idea that because Death Guard didn't follow Tau, because that part of the story has stopped, that somehow Death Guard have been taken out of the picture, that they're no longer involved. I mean, my initial thought when I actually looked and saw, oh, hang on, okay, so it's these 3 factions, Death Guard are involved. My initial thought wasn't, okay, well, that fleet ceased to exist and Death Guard are no longer going to be given anything in the Psychic Awakening series. My first thought was, okay, well, what happened to that fleet then? I mean, it could go many different ways. Personally, I would be disappointed if they did anything other than have the Death Guard be attacked by someone else. There are still plenty of factions that have not had their rules yet, that have not had their entry in the Psychic Awakening series. And if you're going to go after a Plague Fleet, then a pretty good time to do it would be after they are already damaged and battered from fighting another force. If that force disengages and pulls away, that's a pretty opportune moment to spring your trap. I'll be disappointed if it turns out that that's not what they do, but that was my initial thought. Not that, okay, well, they're gone, they're out of the picture. Instead it was, Okay, so who are they going to end up fighting? Because surely you'd go after them at that point. You know, you've now got a clear run at this force. You've now got a fleet that's already been in a fight. If you're fresh and you take them on, you could do some serious damage to that. The short story, I would have thought, most likely is just a precursor to two different Psychic Awakening books, one being The Greater Good and one being whatever one the Death Guard are in. Now, of course, it's unlikely to be Saga of the Beast, because, I mean, I'm 99% sure, that's a lot of 99s, that is just going to be Space Wolves and Orcs, although they could well throw a third faction in there. It would be, I think, a bit out of left field to throw a third faction in there, but they could do it, and Engine War seems to be the one after Saga of the Beast, so we might be looking like 2 books away, but the rate at which Psychic Awakening stuff comes out, it's a bit of time, it's a bit of distance, but it's nothing crazy, it's nothing terrible, it's not years away, it's probably months away, and whilst months is not as good as weeks, it still doesn't mean they've been forgotten or abandoned. They're still going to get their time, it's just not directly in this book. It'll most likely be in another book that starts where that short story left off. Hopefully, that would make the most sense. Anyway, it's one of those things whereby I think Games Workshop, most likely, they wrote that story with that intent in mind, and with it setting up the state of Shadow Sun's forces going into the Greater Good, without necessarily thinking to themselves, well, okay, if the Death Guard are in there, in that story, they have to be next in line, because people won't accept anything else. That is, in a way, a misstep, but I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as people are making out, and it's definitely not as bad as some, like, a few of you have sent me a particular article, shall we say, from one of our favourite websites. I'll give you the name of the article in case you want to look it up yourself, because there is the absolute worst fucking analogy I've ever seen in my life towards the end of that article. But it's Games Workshop drops Death Guard from Psychic Awakening. Nobody knows why. Now, I'll say right now, I've got an issue with that headline by itself. I mean, what does that even mean? Well, actually, sorry, Hobby Community roasts Games Workshop for dropping Death Guard. The URL has changed at some point, I think, because if they're using the software I think they are, they called the page something else to start with. But either way, let's probably just clear that up, even if we won't go into the article itself, because it's garbage. But Games Workshop didn't drop the Death Guard from Psychic Awakening. They clearly didn't, it's just going to be further down the line, and they didn't drop Death Guard from Psychic Awakening the Greater Good, because Death Guard were never in the Greater Good, they were simply in the precursor short story that set up the Tau side of the Greater Good. So yeah, it's not a great situation. It's not like I don't understand why you might be disappointed, I don't understand why you might be frustrated. I absolutely do, but the thing to remember is that it's not the case that Death Guard are going to get nothing. It's not the case that Games Workshop are ignoring them or snubbing them or now hate them and, you know, oh, well, they're never going to get anything ever again. That's not the case at all. They just aren't in this book, but they will be in another, because, as we already know, everyone is getting something. So it might require a little bit of patience, but it's still going to happen eventually. And, like, the overly negative approach to it is not... I just don't think it's a... I don't know. I don't know that it's the correct way to give feedback. Just saying some clarification would have been good before, like when this story was released. That I can 100% get behind. Comments like, you guys are shit, what is your problem? Don't ever do this again. Maybe not so much in the context of it just being a short story. So yeah. That's what we're going to see in the Greater Good. We're going to see Tau, Imperial Guard, and Genestealer Cults. We're not going to see Death Guard, but it's not the end of Death Guard. It doesn't mean that they are going to get nothing. It just means that they are going to get something a little bit later than first thought. And hopefully, whatever they do with Death Guard will involve that short story as part of its basis, so that it has a reason to have mentioned them in the first place. I mean, if it doesn't, then I'm happy to say that that was a mistake. But as of right now, I think it's kind of too early to call that. And when you're doing a galaxy-wide story that affects everyone and their dog, sometimes things will link up in kind of narrative ways, whilst not being all that connected in terms of time frames or releases. So, yeah. Anyway, that turned very rambly. Let me know what you think of all that in the comments down below. And, yeah. Do you reckon it was a misstep? Do you think it was okay? Do you think it was just one of those things whereby it was misconstrued? Or was it perhaps too heavily placed, do you think, for people to think anything other than Death Guard being part of this book? And as such, the feedback is justified. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, feel free to click all the stuff everywhere. Patreon, video subscribe, all that stuff. Click it if you like, don't click if you don't want to. And as always, there's the affiliate link for Element Games in the description down below. You know how it works. You save money, I get something for saying it that way, 10% of it goes to charity, and if you're going to buy, you're going to buy all that stuff anyway. We all know it. You're addicted to the plastic crack, same as me. So, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Toodaloo.